They were about to sell her like livestock until one man shattered everything. Riverside, 1885. Meilin Zhao, 55 years old, stands on an auction block under a merciless sun. The crowd whispers, "Foreigner, useless, too old." She's invisible until she's not, until they decide to erase her completely. Then Cole Maddox slams down his wages and does the unthinkable. He gives her a choice. No chains, no ownership, just humanity. What happens next will shake this town to its core. Stay until the end. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun didn't care who it punished. It beat down on the makeshift platform in Riverside's town square with the same indifference it showed the cracked earth, the dying crops, the people shuffling through another day of drought and desperation. The wood beneath Meilin Zhao's feet was hot enough to burn through the thin soles of her shoes, but she didn't move. Moving would acknowledge the humiliation, and she'd spent 30 years in this country learning that acknowledgement only made things worse. She kept her eyes on the horizon instead, past the crowd, past the judgment, past everything. "Do I hear $5? The auctioneer's voice carried over the murmuring crowd, nasal and bored. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. $5 for the Chinaman woman, strong enough for housework, knows how to keep quiet. Someone laughed. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't really about humor, just cruelty looking for company. Meilin's hands were bound in front of her, not with rope, but with the kind of casual disregard that didn't bother with restraints. Where would she run? She had no money, no papers that mattered, no family left. Her husband had died 3 winters ago, coughing blood into rags they couldn't afford to replace. Her son, their only child, had gone east looking for work and never wrote back. She'd been cleaning houses, mending clothes, doing whatever invisible work white folks would tolerate from a Chinese woman, until Mrs. Henderson decided she didn't need help anymore, and the landlord decided her rent was 3 months overdue. So here she was, public property, human debris. $4, someone called, and that's generous. The auctioneer sighed like he was negotiating the price of spoiled vegetables. $4 to Mr. Yates. Anyone willing to go higher? Meilin finally looked at the crowd. She shouldn't have. Front and center was Martha Cunningham, who'd paid her $2 a week to scrub floors and never once offered her water. Beside Martha stood the banker who'd refused her husband a loan to start his laundry business, the shopkeeper who always watched her hands like she was planning to steal, the minister who'd told her the Chinese couldn't understand salvation. All of them, gathered like this, was entertainment. She recognized others too. Women whose children she'd helped deliver when the white doctor was too drunk or too expensive. Men whose fences she'd repaired, whose animals she'd tended when they were desperate enough to forget their pride. None of them met her eyes now. $4.50, called a voice from the back. $5, countered another. They were bidding on her like she was furniture, like she was less than furniture, because at least furniture had value you could measure. The auctioneer perked up slightly. Now we're getting somewhere. $5 to Mrs. Patterson. Do I hear $6? Meilin felt something crack inside her chest, small and sharp. Not her spirit, that had developed calluses years ago, but something else. Some last thread of the girl who'd crossed the ocean, believing America was where you went to start over, to be free, to build something impossible. That thread snapped clean, and what replaced it wasn't despair. It was colder than that. It was clarity. She would survive this. She always survived. It didn't matter who bought her, what work they demanded, what small indignities they added to the collection she already carried. She would endure it the same way she'd endured everything else, by becoming so invisible they forgot she was human enough to break. $6! Martha Cunningham's voice rang out, sharp with satisfaction. I'll take her. She already knows my house. The auctioneer nodded. $6 to Mrs. Cunningham. Going once. 20. The word cut through the square like a knife through wet cloth. Every head turned. The man who'd spoken was standing at the edge of the crowd, and Meilin realized with a strange jolt that she'd been looking past him this whole time because he didn't fit. He wasn't dressed for town. Dusty work clothes, boots that had seen real use, a hat that had given up trying to hold its shape. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who'd built their own fences, and his face had the kind of weathered look that came from years of sun and decisions that didn't come easy. He didn't look comfortable being here. He looked angry. The auctioneer blinked. Excuse me? $20. The man's voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. That's more than fair for a human being you're selling like cattle. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mei Lin had ever heard. Martha Cunningham's face went red. Cole Maddox, you have no right. I have $20 and you were just bidding $6, Cole said flatly. So either we're doing an auction or we're not. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable now, aware suddenly that the veneer of legality he'd been operating under was thinner than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Sir, this is a debt settlement proceeding. The woman's landlord has the right to recoup, and I'm offering to settle it. Cole didn't raise his voice, but something in it made people take a step back anyway. $20. That's 3 times what you were about to accept. So unless there's another bid, I'd say we're done here. No one spoke. Mei Lin watched him, this stranger, and couldn't make sense of it. She'd seen white men intervene before, usually when they wanted something worse than what was already happening. But this man wasn't looking at her the way men looked at property they were acquiring. He was looking at the auctioneer like he was trying to decide whether to hit him. Going once, the auctioneer said weakly. Twice. He waited, but the crowd had gone still. Whatever entertainment they'd been expecting, this wasn't it. Sold to Mr. Maddox for $20. Cole walked forward and counted out the money with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone saw. When he handed it over, he didn't move to take Mei Lin's arm or lead her away. He just stood there, looking at her for the first time. You got a name? He asked. Her throat was dry. Mei Lin Chow. Mei Lin, he repeated, getting it mostly right. I'm Cole Maddox. I've got a ranch about 10 miles out. More of a disaster than a ranch right now, if I'm honest. I need help, and you look like you know what work is. He paused. But I'm not buying you. I'm offering you a job. Room, board, fair wages when I can pay them. You want it? It's yours. You don't? I'll give you the $20, and you can go wherever you need to go. Mei Lin stared at him. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. Men didn't do this. White men especially didn't do this. There was always a catch, always a price that came due later. But his eyes were steady, and she'd spent 30 years learning to read faces for survival. She didn't see cruelty there. She didn't even see pity. She saw something worse and better at the same time. She saw someone who'd decided the world was wrong and was too tired to pretend otherwise. Why? The word came out smaller than she intended. Because this, Cole gestured at the platform, the crowd, all of it, is shameful, and I've got enough shame of my own without adding to the town's collection. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with his own honesty. Look, I won't lie to you. The ranch is failing. I'm one bad season away from losing everything. I need someone who won't quit when things get hard, and something tells me you're tougher than half the men in this square. But it's your choice. The crowd was murmuring now, a low buzz of confusion and outrage. Martha Cunningham looked like she wanted to spit. The minister was shaking his head. Someone muttered something about race mixing, loud enough to hear. Mei Lin looked at Cole Maddox, the stranger who'd just spent months of wages on the principle of the thing, and made a calculation that had nothing to do with trust and everything to do with odds. She could take the $20. Try to make it to Sacramento, maybe, or San Francisco. Find another Chinese community if one would have her. Spend whatever time she had left scraping by in someone else's shadow. Or she could take a chance on a failing ranch and a man who'd looked at an auction block and decided to burn his money on decency. I'll work, she said. Cole nodded once, like that settled it. He turned to the crowd. Anyone else got a problem with this? Several people looked like they had extensive problems with it, but no one spoke up. Cole Maddox might not have money, but he had something that mattered more in Riverside. A reputation for being able to handle himself and for not caring much what people thought when he'd made up his mind. Then we're done here. He looked at Mei Lin. You got things you need to collect? No. Everything she'd owned had been taken for the debt. She had the clothes she was wearing and nothing else. All right then. He started walking, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. Behind them, the crowd began to break apart, already reshaping the story into something they could tell themselves. The auction had been legal, after all, and if some fool rancher wanted to waste his money on a charity case, that was his problem. But Mei Lin heard what they weren't saying, too. She heard it in the way Martha Cunningham's voice dropped to a hiss, in the way the men clustered together like they were planning something. This wasn't over. In a town like Riverside, nothing was ever over until everyone agreed on the ending. Cole had a wagon waiting at the edge of town, an old thing that had been repaired so many times it was hard to tell what was original. He helped her up, actual help, his hand steady and impersonal, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town fell away behind them, replaced by endless stretches of brown grass and desperate-looking fields. The drought had hit everyone hard, but out here it was even more obvious. Creeks that should have been running were just cracked mud. Trees that should have been green were gray and struggling. "It's bad," Cole said finally, following her gaze. "Worst dry spell in 20 years. Most of the big ranches are surviving on wells and meanness. Smaller operations like mine." He shrugged. "We're improvising." "How long have you had the ranch?" Maylin asked. Her English was good, better than most people expected, but she chose her words carefully anyway. 5 years. Bought it with money from the railroad work, back when I was young and stupid enough to think I could make this land cooperate. He glanced at her. "You don't have to make conversation if you don't want to. I know today was—" He stopped, like he couldn't find a word bad enough. "Humiliating," Maylin supplied. "Yeah." He looked uncomfortable. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. What they did to you, what they were doing, it's wrong. And I know saying that doesn't fix anything, but why did you stop it?" She turned to look at him directly. "The truth." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the reins. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "My wife died 4 years ago. Fever took her in 3 days, so fast I barely understood it was happening. And after, when I was trying to figure out what to do with all her things, all the life we'd built." He paused. The town showed up. Neighbors, church people, everyone. They took her clothes, her furniture, things she'd loved, said they were helping, said I couldn't handle it alone. And I was too broken to fight them, so I just let them. Maylin understood. "They stole from you." "They did it legally," Cole said bitterly. That's what made it worse. Everything by the book, everything proper. And I stood there and let it happen because I didn't have the strength to tell them no. He met her eyes. "When I saw you on that platform today, I saw myself 4 years ago, and I decided I was done letting things happen." It was the most honest answer anyone had given her in years. Maylin settled back into the seat, watching the landscape roll by. "Your ranch," she said after a while. "Tell me about it." Cole almost smiled. "You mean tell you what you're getting into?" "Yes." "All right, it's 200 acres, give or take. About half of it's decent grazing land when there's rain, which there hasn't been. I've got maybe 30 head of cattle left. Used to be 60, but I had to sell them off to pay debts. There's a main house, barn, couple of outbuildings that are falling apart. Well's still good, thank everything, but I'm using most of that water for the kitchen garden and the animals. Fences need work. Roof needs work. Hell, everything needs work." "And you run it alone?" "Had a hired man for a while, but he left last month when I couldn't pay him." Cole's jaw tightened. "Can't blame him. Man's gotta eat." "So you're paying me with money you don't have?" "I'm paying you with money I just spent," Cole corrected. "And yeah, I'll figure out the rest later. I always do." They rode in silence after that, and Maylin used the time to think. She was trying to add it all up. The failing ranch, the desperate owner, the enormous risk he'd just taken on her behalf. It didn't balance. People didn't do things like this without a reason, and she hadn't figured out his yet. But when they crested a small rise and she saw the ranch spread out below them, she understood something else. This wasn't just a property to Cole Maddox. This was the last thing standing between him and the kind of grief that swallowed people whole. The main house was small but solidly built, weathered gray by sun and wind. The barn leaned slightly to one side, and she could see gaps in the roof even from here. Fences ran in crooked lines across the property, many of them sagging or broken. But there were signs of care too, a neat vegetable garden near the house, tools stored properly under a lean-to, animals that looked thin but healthy. It was the kind of place that needed everything and promised nothing. It was perfect. "Not much to look at," Cole said quietly. "I've seen worse." Maylin studied the layout with a practical eye. "The barn roof, how long has it been like that?" 2 months? Got damaged in a storm and I haven't had time to fix it." And the fences? Some of them are 10 years old. They were already failing when I bought the place. She nodded, still cataloging. You have materials? Wood, nails, tools? Some. Not enough, but some. Then we start there. She looked at him. I grew up in Guangdong. My father was a farmer. I know how to work land, fix things, make do with nothing. You need help. I need... She paused, choosing her words carefully. I need to be useful again. Something shifted in Cole's expression, some tightness easing. You're hired then, officially. He drove the wagon down to the house and helped her down. Up close, everything looked worse. The peeling paint, the cracked windows, the steps that sagged under their weight. But it was clean, and when Cole opened the door, she could see he'd been trying. The main room was sparse but organized, dishes washed and stacked, floor swept. There's a spare room, he said, gesturing to a door on the left. It's small, but it's yours. I'll stay out of your way, and I expect you to stay out of mine unless we're working. We eat at sunup and sundown. Nothing fancy, but there's enough. Any questions? Mei-Lin walked to the spare room and looked inside. A bed, a chair, a small table. A window that looked out over the fields. It was more than she'd expected, more than she'd had in years. When do we start? She asked. Cole glanced at the sun, still high despite the late hour. Dawn tomorrow soon enough? Dawn tomorrow. He nodded and turned to go, then stopped. Mei-Lin, I meant what I said in town. You're not a servant here. You're not property. You're a person I hired to help save this place, and I'm grateful for it. If anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. Understood? She looked at this strange, angry, grieving man who'd decided to fight an entire town's worth of cruelty with $20 and a job offer. Understood, she said. That night, Mei-Lin lay in the narrow bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Wind through the gaps in the walls. Mice skittering in the spaces between floors. Somewhere outside, one of the cattle lowing softly. She'd expected to feel afraid. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She felt like she had work to do, real work, the kind that mattered. And for the first time since her husband died, for the first time since her son disappeared, for the first time since she'd stood on that platform and felt the weight of every person who'd decided she was worthless. For the first time, Mei-Lin Zhao felt like she might belong somewhere after all. Dawn came early and unforgiving. Mei-Lin was already awake, dressed in the same clothes from yesterday because they were the only clothes she had. She'd washed her face in the basin Cole had left in her room, braided her gray-streaked hair back tight, and was standing in the main room when he emerged from his own quarters, looking surprised. You're up, he said. You said dawn. She nodded toward the door. Show me what needs doing. Cole grabbed 2 tin cups and poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the stove, strong enough to strip paint from the smell of it. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it, which she appreciated. Assumptions about preference she could handle. Assumptions about capability were different. They drank standing up, and then Cole led her outside into the cool morning air. All right, he said, surveying his failing kingdom. Where do you want to start? Mei-Lin had been thinking about this since she woke up. She'd spent the last hour before dawn watching the light change through her window, cataloging everything she'd seen yesterday, building a priority list in her head. The barn roof, she said. If it rains, you lose whatever's stored inside. Everything else can wait. Cole looked at her with something like respect. You're not wrong. I've got some boards salvaged from an old shed. They're not pretty, but they'll hold. You know your way around a hammer? Show me what you need, and I'll learn the rest. They worked through the morning in a rhythm that surprised them both. Cole was patient in a way Mei-Lin hadn't expected. He showed her once how he wanted things done, then trusted her to do it. No hovering, no corrections unless she asked. When she fumbled with the unfamiliar weight of the hammer, he didn't take it from her hands. He just adjusted her grip and let her try again. By noon, they'd patched 3 of the worst holes in the barn roof. It wasn't beautiful work, but it would hold. You've done this before, Cole said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Not roofing, but fixing things that were broken? Yes. Mei-Lin climbed down the ladder with more confidence than she'd climbed up. My husband and I, we had a small laundry business in Sacramento for a while. The building was always falling apart. You learn, or you lose everything. What happened to it? The business? Burned down. She said it flatly, without emotion. Someone decided they didn't like Chinese competition. We rebuilt, but it burned again. After that, we couldn't afford to keep trying. Cole's expression darkened. They ever catch who did it? No. She looked at him steadily. They never tried. He was quiet for a moment, and Mei Lin watched him process that, watched him add it to whatever understanding he was building of how the world actually worked versus how it was supposed to. Come on, he said finally. We'll eat something, then tackle the fences. Lunch was bread and cheese and water from the well. Simple food, but there was enough of it, and Cole didn't eat first or take the larger portion. He split everything down the middle and handed her half like it was the most natural thing in the world. They ate in the shade of the house, too tired to talk much. Mei Lin's hands were already blistering, soft from months of indoor work, but she didn't mention it. Blisters healed. Weakness got you sent away. You asked me yesterday why I did it, Cole said suddenly. Stop the auction. Mei Lin looked up from her bread. I didn't tell you everything. He stared out at his broken fences, his dying land. After my wife died, I stopped caring about much of anything. Kept the ranch going because it was all I knew how to do, but I wasn't living. I was just existing. And this morning before I went into town, I was thinking maybe it was time to quit. Sell the place, move on, start over somewhere else. He paused. Then I saw what they were doing to you, and I got angry. Really angry. The kind of angry that makes you do stupid things.
Spending $20 is stupid? Mei Lin asked. Spending $20 I needed for seeds is pretty damn stupid. Yeah. But he smiled when he said it, tired and real. But you know what? I don't regret it, because for the first time in 4 years, I felt something other than empty, and that's worth more than seeds. Mei Lin didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They finished eating and got back to work. The fences were worse than they'd looked from a distance. Posts rotted through, wire rusted and broken, entire sections collapsed. Cole had materials to fix maybe a quarter of what needed doing, and even that was optimistic. We'll do what we can, he said, surveying the damage. Priority is keeping the cattle from wandering onto Hale's property. Hale? Victor Hale. Owns the big ranch east of here. Cole's voice went flat. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. Keeps offering less each time, like he's waiting for me to get desperate enough to accept whatever he throws at me. And you won't sell? This land… Cole stopped, struggling with something. My wife loved this place. She's buried up on that hill under the oak tree. I sell, and whoever buys it won't care about that. They'll plow right over her like she never existed. His jaw tightened. So no, I won't sell. They worked until the sun started dropping, repairing what they could with what they had. Mei Lin's hands were screaming by the end of it, blisters on top of blisters, but she'd learned a long time ago how to work through pain. Pain was just information. It told you where your limits were so you could decide whether to respect them or ignore them. Today, she ignored them. When they finally stopped, the shadows were long and purple across the fields. They'd fixed maybe 50 feet of fence, a pathetic amount compared to what needed doing, but more than Cole had managed in weeks on his own. You're tougher than you look, he said, noting the way she cradled her hands. I look tough, Mei Lin replied. That surprised a laugh out of him, short and rusty, like he didn't use it often. Yeah, you do. Come on, let's get some food in us before we both collapse. Dinner was beans and salt pork, cooked over the stove in a pan that had seen better decades. Cole wasn't much of a cook, but neither was Mei Lin, so they suffered through it together without complaint. After, while Cole cleaned up, Mei Lin stepped outside into the cooling evening. The sky was enormous out here, bigger than it ever seemed in town, painted in shades of orange and red and purple that had no business being that beautiful over land this broken. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Cole. Pretty, isn't it? He said quietly. Yes. They stood there in silence, two people who'd been alone for too long, watching the day end over a ranch that was barely holding on. Mei Lin, Cole said after a while, I know I said this would be just a job, but I need you to know something. People in town, they're going to talk. Hell, they're already talking. And some of them are going to say things, do things, to try to make you leave, to make me send you away. I know. And I need you to know that I won't. Send you away, I mean, not because of gossip, not because of pressure. You do the work, you keep your word, this job is yours for as long as you want it. Mei Lin turned to look at him. In the fading light, he looked older than he probably was, worn down by grief and drought, and the sheer exhaustion of trying to keep something alive that the world wanted dead. Why does it matter to you, she asked, what they think? It doesn't, Cole said simply. That's the point. I spent 4 years caring what everyone thought, trying to be the man they expected me to be after Sarah died. The grateful widower. The one who'd move on respectfully, find another nice woman, keep the ranch going the right way. And all it did was make me hollow. He met her eyes. I'm done being hollow. I'd rather be broke and honest than comfortable and empty. It was the kind of declaration that should have sounded dramatic, but coming from Cole, covered in dust, hands blistered, staring at a ranch that might not survive another season, it just sounded true. Then we'll be broke and honest together, Mei Lin said. Something passed between them then. Not friendship exactly, but the beginning of understanding. They were both holding on to things the world wanted them to let go of, both refusing to disappear just because it would be easier for everyone else. The sky darkened, and eventually they went inside. That night, Mei Lin lay in bed and felt the ache in every muscle, every joint, every blister that would be worse tomorrow. And she smiled, because pain meant she'd done something that mattered. Pain meant she was still here. The next week fell into a pattern. Wake before dawn, work until exhaustion, sleep hard, and dreamless. They moved through the ranch like a small army, Cole and Mei Lin, tackling problems in order of urgency. More fence repairs. Clearing brush that had grown too close to the house. Reorganizing the barn so they could find tools without excavating. Small victories that added up to something that almost looked like progress. Mei Lin learned quickly how to drive a nail without bending it, how to read the land for water signs, how to handle the cattle without getting trampled. Cole was a good teacher when he bothered to teach. Mostly, he just showed her once and trusted her to figure out the rest, which was exactly the kind of teaching she responded to. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about important things at first, just small observations, shared frustrations, the kind of comments that made work less lonely. But gradually, in pieces, they started filling in the gaps of who they were when they weren't fighting to survive. Cole told her about growing up poor in Missouri, about working the railroads until he'd saved enough to buy land, about meeting Sarah at a church social and knowing immediately she was too good for him. Mei Lin told him about Guangdong province, about her family's farm, about the flooding that destroyed their crops and pushed them toward desperate choices, about the recruitment agent who promised wealth in America, about the ocean voyage that killed half the people in steerage, about arriving in San Francisco and realizing the promises were lies. They didn't share everything. There were still walls, still private grief they weren't ready to touch. But the silence between them changed from uncomfortable to companionable, and that was something. On the 8th day, they had their first visitor. Mei Lin was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard hoofbeats. She straightened, wiping her hands on her pants, and watched through the open door as a man rode up to the house. He was older, well-dressed in a way that immediately announced money. Everything about him was deliberate, from the way he sat his horse to the expensive watch chain visible across his vest. He dismounted with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no in any way that mattered. Cole came out of the house, and even from a distance, Mei Lin could see the tension in his shoulders. "Hale," Cole said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Maddox?" Victor Hale's voice was smooth, practiced. "Heard you caused quite a stir in town last week." "Did you now?" "Bought yourself a China woman at auction. People are talking." Hale's eyes scanned the property, cataloging everything. "Can't say it's the best decision you've made, but then again, you've made a lot of questionable decisions lately." Mei Lin stayed where she was, half hidden in the barn's shadow, listening. "My hiring practices aren't your concern," Cole said flatly. "No, but your ranch is." Hale smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to make you an offer. A final offer, really. $12,000 for the whole property. Land, cattle, buildings, everything. That's more than fair given the state of things." "Not interested."
Cole, be reasonable. You're barely holding on here. One bad season, hell, one bad week, and you'll lose it all anyway. Take my offer, walk away with something, start over somewhere else. I said no. Hale's smile faded. This land should be part of a larger operation, managed properly by people who know what they're doing. You're wasting it with your sentiment and your stubbornness. My wife is buried here, Cole said, and his voice went dangerously quiet. So unless you're planning to offer me enough money to buy back what matters, you can take your $12,000 and get off my property. For a moment, Hale's mask slipped, and Mei Lin saw what was underneath. Not anger exactly, but calculation. The look of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and was willing to be patient about it. Fine, Hale said smoothly. But when you change your mind, and you will, don't expect this offer to still be standing. He remounted his horse, then paused. And Maddox? That China woman you hired? People are already talking about what that means, about what kind of man keeps that kind of company. Might want to think about what that does to your reputation. He rode off before Cole could respond. Mei Lin waited until he was gone, then emerged from the barn. Cole was standing in the same spot, fists clenched, staring at nothing. You heard that, he said, without looking at her. Yes. He's not wrong about the reputation part. This is a small town, and people have long memories for anything that looks like scandal. Are you asking me to leave? Cole turned sharply. What? No. Hell no. I'm warning you. It's going to get worse before it gets better. People like Hale, they don't give up easy, and they don't fight fair. But Mei Lin walked over to stand beside him, looking in the direction Hale had ridden. In China, we have a saying, the tree that doesn't bend in the wind breaks. But there's another part people forget. Some trees are meant to break. Because when they do, they fall on what's trying to break them. Cole looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw him really smile. Not the tired, half-broken thing he'd been offering, but something genuine. You planning on falling on Victor Hale? If necessary. That pulled a real laugh from him, and the tension in his shoulders eased. Come on, those stalls won't muck themselves. They went back to work, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again. But that night, Mei Lin lay awake thinking about what Hale had said, about reputation, about scandal, about what kind of man keeps that kind of company. She'd spent 30 years being that kind of person, the kind that made proper folks uncomfortable, the kind that got blamed for everything from bad luck to bad weather. She'd thought she was used to it, but being the reason Cole Maddox lost his reputation, being the excuse people used to tear down what little he had left, that was different. She told herself it didn't matter. She was here to work, nothing more. What people said about either of them was irrelevant as long as the ranch survived. But late at night, in the dark, she couldn't help wondering, what happened when surviving wasn't enough anymore? What happened when you wanted to live instead? The question followed her into uneasy sleep, and she didn't have an answer. Not yet. 3 weeks passed before the trouble started in earnest. Mei Lin had fallen into the rhythm of the ranch like she'd been born to it. Her hands had toughened, the blisters becoming calluses, and she moved through the work with an efficiency that surprised even her. She'd repaired half the fencing on the eastern boundary, reorganized the tool shed so everything had a place, and coaxed the vegetable garden back from the edge of death with careful rationing of well water and sheer determination. Cole watched her work with something close to amazement. She didn't complain, didn't slow down, didn't ask for help unless she genuinely needed it. And when she did need help, she asked in a way that made it clear she was solving a problem, not admitting weakness. They developed a shorthand, the way people do when they work side by side every day. A nod meant yes, a shake meant no. A particular look meant the fence post was rotted through and they needed to start over. They could go hours without speaking, and it didn't feel strange. But the silence in town was different. Cole went in for supplies every week, and each time he came back quieter than before. He didn't talk about what people said, but Mei Lin could read it in the set of his jaw, the way he unloaded the wagon with more force than necessary. She didn't ask. There was no point. She knew what they were saying. The storm broke on a Tuesday. Mei Lin was working in the barn, cleaning tack that hadn't been properly maintained in months, when she heard horses, multiple horses. She set down the bridle she'd been oiling and walked to the door. 5 men sat on horseback in the yard, arranged in a loose semicircle like they'd practiced the formation. She recognized the one in the center immediately. Same expensive clothes, same calculated smile. Victor Hale. The others were his men, ranch hands from the look of them, but the kind who got paid for more than just herding cattle. They had the eyes of men who enjoyed their work a little too much. Cole came out of the house, and Mei Lin saw him take in the situation with one glance. He walked forward slowly, positioning himself between the riders and the barn where she stood. "Hale," he said, "you're trespassing." "Just being neighborly," Hale replied smoothly. "Heard you've been having some trouble with your fences. Thought I'd offer some assistance." "Don't need it." "See, that's where you're wrong." Hale's smile didn't waver. "A ranch this size, in this condition, it's a liability to the whole area. Sick cattle wandering onto my land, fences so poor they're basically invitations for rustlers. It affects everyone." "My cattle aren't sick and my fences are fine." "Are they?" Hale nodded to one of his men who pulled out a piece of paper. "County inspector came by my property last week, said he'd gotten complaints about livestock management in this area. Now, I wonder who he might be talking about." Cole's hands flexed at his sides. "You filed a complaint against me." "I filed a legitimate concern with the proper authorities. If your operation is up to standard, you've got nothing to worry about." Hale's eyes flicked past Cole to where Mei Lin stood watching. "Of course, having proper help might make a difference. Real ranch hands who know what they're doing, not, well, you know." Mei Lin stepped out of the barn. She'd been silent long enough. "The fences are repaired," she said clearly. "The cattle are healthy. If you have complaints, you should make them to someone who cares." One of Hale's men laughed, an ugly sound. "Listen to that. The China woman's got opinions." "Jake?" Hale said mildly, but he didn't look displeased. "Let's keep this civil." Mei Lin walked closer, studying each man in turn. She'd learned to read violence in men's faces. It was a survival skill she'd developed young and honed over 30 years. These men weren't here to talk. They were here to intimidate, to establish dominance, to make Cole feel small in his own yard. She stopped next to Cole, close enough that it was clear they were standing together. "You want the ranch?" she said to Hale. It wasn't a question. "I want what's best for the community," Hale corrected. "And what's best is consolidation, proper management. Not this," he gestured vaguely, "whatever this is." "This is a working ranch," Cole said, his voice tight. "And you need to leave, now." "Or what?" The man called Jake leaned forward in his saddle. "You gonna make us? You and your—" He said a word that made Mei Lin's stomach clench, not because she hadn't heard it before, but because she'd hoped she wouldn't hear it here. Cole moved fast. One moment he was standing still, the next he had his rifle. When had he grabbed that? Leveled at Jake's chest. "Get off my land," he said quietly. "All of you, right now." The tension crystallized, sharp enough to cut. Hale's men reached for their own weapons, and for a breathless moment Mei Lin thought this was it. This was where everything collapsed into violence and blood, and the end of whatever fragile thing they'd been building. Then Hale laughed. "Easy, boys." He held up a hand and his men subsided. "No need for drama, we're just talking." He looked at Cole with something almost like pity. "But you should think carefully about what you're doing here, Maddox. Think about what it looks like. Think about what people are saying." "I don't give a damn what people are saying." "You should." Hale gathered his reins. "Because when the county inspector comes, and he will come, people's opinions matter. And right now those opinions aren't in your favor." He tipped his hat, mockingly polite. "Good day to you both." They rode out slowly, deliberately, making it clear they were leaving by choice, not because they'd been forced. Mei Lin watched them go and felt something cold settle in her chest. Cole lowered the rifle, and she saw his hands were shaking. "You okay?" she asked. "No." He turned to look at her, and his face was drawn. "This is what I was afraid of. Hale doesn't care about the ranch. He could buy 10 ranches this size without blinking. He cares about winning, about making sure everyone knows he gets what he wants. And what he wants is for you to fail. What he wants is for me to break." Cole ran a hand through his hair. "And the hell of it is, he's patient. He'll file complaints, spread rumors, make my life difficult in 100 small ways until I'm too tired to fight anymore." Mei Lin thought about this, turning it over in her mind. She'd dealt with men like Hale before, men who used systems and bureaucracy and social pressure as weapons. You couldn't fight them directly. They had too much power, too many resources. But they also had weaknesses. They always did. "The inspector," she said. "When does he come?" "Could be tomorrow, could be next month. Hale's got influence, but even he can't control the county's schedule completely. Then we make sure there's nothing to find." She looked at the ranch with fresh eyes, cataloging every possible weakness. "We fix everything, make it perfect. So when this inspector comes, he has no choice but to approve." Cole stared at her. "Maylin, we're barely keeping up with basic maintenance. Making everything perfect would take months of work and money we don't have. Then we start with what matters most and work our way down." She turned to face him fully. "You said you were done being hollow, done caring what people think. So prove it. Show them they can't break you." Something shifted in Cole's expression. The defeat faded, replaced by the stubborn determination she was beginning to recognize as his default setting when pushed. "All right," he said. "All right, let's make a list." They spent the next hour going over every inch of the property, writing down what needed fixing, what needed improving, what needed replacing entirely. The list grew depressingly long, but Maylin refused to let that stop her. "We prioritize," she said. "Fences first. They have to be solid. Then the barn? Then the cattle themselves. Everything else can wait. The garden is already good enough. I've been managing it. The inspector won't care about vegetables." Cole nodded slowly. "You're right. Okay. We focus on what he'll actually inspect." They worked until dark that night, and then kept working by lamplight. Maylin's back ached and her hands were bleeding again from new blisters on top of the old calluses, but she didn't stop. Neither did Cole. Somewhere around midnight, they finally collapsed at the kitchen table, too exhausted to do more. "Why are you doing this?" Cole asked quietly. "You could leave. Find work somewhere else, somewhere easier. You don't owe me anything." Maylin looked at him across the scarred wooden table. This man who'd spent $20 he couldn't afford on principle, who'd given her dignity when the world was selling her like livestock. "Yes, I do," she said simply. "You gave me back something I thought was gone. I won't walk away from that." Cole's throat worked. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. They went to bed in their separate rooms and slept like the dead. The next 3 weeks were brutal. They worked from before sunrise to well after dark, driven by the knowledge that the inspector could arrive any day. Maylin learned to ignore exhaustion the way she'd once learned to ignore hunger, as just another fact of existence, irrelevant to what needed doing. The fences went up straight and strong. Cole had materials for maybe a third of what needed replacing, so Maylin got creative. She salvaged wood from collapsed sections of an old storage shed, straightened bent nails, reused wire that was still good. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. The barn roof got a complete overhaul. They couldn't afford new shingles, so they patched and sealed and prayed it would hold. Maylin climbed up there herself, despite Cole's protests, because she was lighter and the old wood was treacherous. "If you fall and break your neck, I'm not explaining it to anyone," Cole called up. "Then I won't fall," she called back and focused on the work. The cattle got checked, rechecked, and checked again. They were thin from the drought, but healthy otherwise. Maylin made sure their water troughs were clean and their feed was properly stored. She reorganized the barn so everything had a place and could be found quickly. Cole watched her work with growing respect and something else, something he wasn't ready to name yet. She was relentless. When he wanted to rest, she kept going. When he was ready to give up on a particular fence post as unfixable, she found a way to fix it. She had a stubborn, grinding determination that reminded him of Sarah. Except where Sarah had been optimistic and cheerful, Maylin was practical and unyielding. One evening, after another 16-hour day, Cole found her sitting on the porch steps, staring at her hands. They were a mess, blistered, cut, stained with pitch and dirt and blood. He sat down beside her without saying anything, pulling out a tin of salve he kept for the horses. "Give me your hands," he said. Maylin looked at him skeptically. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding. Give me your hands." She held them out, and he worked the salve into the worst of the damage with surprising gentleness. His own hands were rough and scarred, but his touch was careful. "You're going to work yourself to death," he said quietly. "Better than the alternative." "Is it?" He looked up at her. Maylin, I appreciate what you're doing, I do. But this pace isn't sustainable. You're going to break. I won't.
How do you know? Because I've been breaking for 30 years and I'm still here. She pulled her hands back gently. I know what I can survive. This is nothing. Cole wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that survival wasn't the same as living, that you could endure for so long you forgot what it felt like to actually be alive. But he didn't, because he wasn't sure he had the right to tell her anything about living when he'd spent 4 years as a ghost himself. Instead, he said, "Thank you for caring about this place, about keeping it going." "It's not just the place," Maylin said. "It's—" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "When I was on that auction block, I thought my life was over, thought I'd reached the end of mattering, and then you stepped in and showed me I was wrong. So this isn't about the ranch. It's about proving that moment wasn't a mistake." Cole felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen for a long time. "It wasn't a mistake," he said. "Best $20 I ever spent." Maylin smiled, rare and genuine, and they sat there in the cooling evening until the mosquitoes drove them inside. The inspector came on a Thursday. Maylin saw him first, a thin man in a dark suit riding a government horse, carrying a leather folder full of official papers. She was working on the last section of fence on the northern boundary, and she straightened slowly, watching him approach the main house. By the time she got there, Cole was already outside, and the inspector was dismounting. "Mr. Maddox?" The inspector's voice was precise and bureaucratic. "I'm Theodore Grant, County Livestock Inspector. I've received a complaint about conditions on this property, and I'm here to conduct an evaluation." "Of course." Cole's voice was steady, betraying none of the tension Maylin knew he was feeling. "What do you need to see?" "Everything." Grant pulled out a sheaf of papers. Fencing, livestock, buildings, water sources. "I'll need to inspect it all and file a complete report." Maylin stayed back, letting Cole take the lead. She knew her presence would only complicate things, give the inspector another thing to judge. But Grant noticed her anyway. His eyes flicked over her, cataloging and dismissing in the same glance. "This your hired help?" he asked Cole. "This is Maylin Zhao. She's been working here for a month." Grant made a note on his papers. "Let's start with the livestock." They walked the property for the next 3 hours. Grant was thorough. Maylin had to give him that. He checked every fence post, examined every cow, measured the water troughs, inspected the barn from foundation to roof peak. He asked detailed questions about feed schedules, breeding records, health protocols. Cole answered everything calmly, showing Grant the records he'd kept, the improvements they'd made. Maylin followed at a distance, watching Grant's face for any sign of what he was thinking. She couldn't read him. He was too practiced at neutrality. Finally, as the sun was starting to drop, Grant finished his inspection. He stood in the yard, reviewing his notes while Cole and Maylin waited. "Well?" Cole asked when the silence stretched too long. Grant looked up. "The property is adequate. Fencing meets minimum standards, livestock appears healthy, buildings are structurally sound if not aesthetically pleasing." He paused. "However," Maylin's stomach dropped. "There are concerns about management practices," Grant continued. "The use of—" He glanced at Maylin. "Unconventional labor raises questions about your judgment and the ranch's long-term viability." "Unconventional labor?" Cole's voice went dangerous. "You mean hiring someone who isn't white?" "I mean employing someone with no documented ranching experience or references." "She's got more ranching sense than half the men in this county." Grant's expression didn't change. "That may be, but appearance matters in these assessments. The county has standards, Mr. Maddox, standards that reflect community values." Maylin stepped forward. She'd been silent long enough. "What did you find wrong with the ranch itself?" she asked clearly. "The fences, the cattle, the buildings? What failed your inspection?" Grant looked at her like she'd committed some minor social crime by speaking. "I didn't say anything failed." "Then the ranch passes." She held his gaze. "Your personal opinions about who should or shouldn't work here aren't part of the inspection criteria, are they?" The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Grant's jaw tightened. "The inspection is complete. You'll receive my official report within the week." He gathered his papers and moved toward his horse. "Mr. Grant," Maylin said,
and her voice carried something that made him pause. When you write that report, you should know something. We've documented every improvement made to this property. We have receipts, dates, records, and if your report doesn't match the facts, we'll know exactly why. It was a bluff. They didn't have nearly that level of documentation, but her voice was steady and certain, and Grant didn't know her well enough to doubt it. He mounted his horse without responding and rode away. Cole waited until he was out of sight, then turned to Mei Lin. That was either brilliant or disastrous. Both, probably. She watched the dust settle where Grant had ridden. But he needed to know we won't just roll over. He's going to file a report that makes us look bad. You know that, right? Maybe, but he's also going to think twice about lying in an official document if he thinks we can prove otherwise. She turned to Cole. Sometimes perception is as important as reality. Cole looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Where'd you learn to play politics like that? Survival. Mei Lin started walking back toward the barn. When you're invisible, you learn to pay attention. You learn what people fear, what they value, what makes them hesitate, and you use it. That night, they didn't talk much. The tension of waiting for Grant's report hung over everything like a storm cloud. But 3 days later, when the official document arrived, it was better than they'd hoped. Grant had noted minor concerns about management consistency and recommended a follow-up inspection in 6 months, but he'd found no violations, no grounds for closure or seizure. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Cole read the report twice, then set it on the table and laughed. A real laugh, surprised and relieved. We did it, he said. We actually did it. Mei Lin allowed herself a small smile. We survived. That's different than winning. I'll take it. They celebrated with coffee instead of whiskey. Neither of them drank much, and went to bed early, exhausted but lighter than they'd been in weeks. But Mei Lin couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, thinking about Grant's face when she'd challenged him, about the way Cole had stood beside her even when it would have been easier to distance himself. She thought about the ranch and how it had started to feel less like a job and more like something else, something dangerous. Because jobs you could leave. Jobs didn't matter beyond the paycheck. But this? This was starting to matter in ways that scared her. She was 55 years old. She'd learned a long time ago not to hope for more than survival. Hope was expensive. Hope got you hurt. But lying there in the dark, listening to the ranch settle around her, she felt it anyway. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be more than temporary. Hope that she'd found something worth keeping, and that terrified her more than any inspector or any threat ever could. The hope didn't last long. 2 weeks after the inspection, the barn caught fire. Mei Lin woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of cattle screaming. She was out of bed and running before her mind fully caught up, bursting out of the house in her nightdress to see flames already consuming the eastern wall of the barn. Cole was closer, already throwing buckets of water that evaporated before they made any difference. The fire was too big, too hot, feeding on dry wood and old hay like it had been waiting for this moment. "The cattle!" Mei Lin shouted over the roar. "I got them out." Cole's face was black with soot. "But the horses!" She didn't wait for him to finish. She grabbed a piece of wet cloth from the water trough, wrapped it around her face, and ran into the barn through the side entrance that wasn't burning yet. The smoke was immediate and choking. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, couldn't breathe without coughing, but she knew this barn now, knew every board, every nail, every corner. She moved on instinct and memory, feeling her way to the horse stalls in the back. Both horses were there, wild-eyed and panicked, fighting their halters. The fire hadn't reached them yet, but the smoke was getting worse by the second. Mei Lin got the first horse free and slapped its flank hard, sending it bolting toward the door. The second one was harder. It was rearing, fighting her, too terrified to understand she was trying to save it. A beam cracked overhead and sparks rained down, and Mei Lin felt the heat getting closer, felt the building starting to give way. She got the halter off through sheer force of will and pulled the horse toward the exit, half dragging it, both of them coughing and stumbling. The smoke was so thick now she couldn't tell which way was out, couldn't see anything but orange and black and her own hands pulling the rope. Then Cole was there, grabbing the horse's other side, and together they hauled it through the side door and into the yard. The horse took off running the moment it was free, and Mei Lin collapsed on the ground, coughing so hard she thought her lungs would tear. Cole pulled her further from the building just as the roof caved in with a roar that sounded like the end of the world. They sat there in the dirt, watching everything they'd worked for burn. The barn was a total loss. By the time the fire burned itself out, there was nothing left but charred beams and ashes. Cole's tools, their winter hay, all the materials they'd salvaged and saved, gone. The sun came up on devastation. Mei Lin sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, her throat raw and her lungs aching. Cole was walking through the ruins, trying to salvage anything that might be useful. His face was blank, shut down, and she recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn on the auction block. He came back empty-handed and sat beside her without speaking. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the smoke rise from what used to be their barn. "It was deliberate," Cole said finally. His voice was rough from smoke and something darker. "I found a can of kerosene in the weeds out back. Someone set this." Mei Lin had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the anger she'd been holding back flare hot and sharp. "Hale," she said. "Can't prove it. He's too smart to do it himself, and whoever he sent didn't leave evidence." Cole's hands clenched. "But yeah, Hale." "What do we do?" Cole laughed, bitter and broken. "What can we do? File a complaint with the sheriff who's in Hale's pocket? Rebuild with money we don't have? Face facts and admit we're done?" Mei Lin looked at him sharply. "You're giving up." "I'm being realistic. We barely survived the inspection. Now we've lost the barn, the hay, everything we need to get through winter. Even if I wanted to rebuild, I can't afford it, and Hale knows it. He's just waiting for me to accept his offer." "So accept it." Mei Lin's voice was flat. "Sell him the ranch. Walk away. That's what you want to do, isn't it?" Cole turned to face her, and his eyes were haunted. "What I want doesn't matter. Sarah's buried up on that hill. This land, it's all I have left of her. But wanting something and being able to keep it aren't the same thing." "No," Mei Lin said. "They're not. But you told me once you were done being hollow, done caring what other people wanted. So which is it, Cole? Are you going to fight or fold?" "Fight with what? We've got nothing left. We've got each other." The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest and more revealing than she'd intended. "We've got this land and these cattle and our own two hands. That's more than I had when you pulled me off that auction block. It's more than you had when your wife died and the town picked you clean. So unless you're ready to prove Hale right, prove that you really are too broken to keep going, then get up and figure out what we do next." Cole stared at her like she'd slapped him. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. The defeat faded, replaced by the stubborn anger she'd come to associate with him making decisions that went against common sense. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. I'm not giving him the satisfaction." "Good. So, what's the plan?" Cole stood up, looking at the ruins of the barn with new eyes. "We rebuild. Not the whole thing. We can't afford that. But enough to get us through winter. We salvage what we can from what's left. We use what materials we have, and we make it work." "And Hale?" "Hale can wait. Right now, we focus on surviving." They spent the next 3 days sorting through the wreckage. Most of it was useless, but Cole had been right about one thing. He was good at making do with nothing. They found nails that could be straightened, boards that were only scorched on one side, metal fittings that had survived the heat. It wasn't much, but it was something. On the 4th day, while they were laying out their salvaged materials to see what they actually had to work with, a rider approached from the direction of town. Mei Lin tensed, expecting trouble. But the woman who dismounted was young, maybe 25, dressed in a simple work dress and riding a horse that had seen better days. "Mr. Maddox?" Her voice was uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard about the fire and I needed to talk to someone." Cole exchanged a glance with Mei Lin, then nodded. "What's your name?" "Emma. Emma Carter." She twisted her hands together nervously. "I work for the Hales, or I did. I left 3 days ago and I don't know where else to go." Mei Lin studied this girl more closely. There were bruises on her wrists, half hidden by her sleeves. Her eyes kept darting around like she expected someone to appear. "Why'd you leave?" Cole asked, his voice gentler than Mei Lin had heard it. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Hale, he's not what people think. He's not just ruthless in business. He's cruel.
And Mrs. Hale, she looks the other way because it's easier than facing what her husband is. I couldn't, her voice broke. I couldn't stay there anymore. Not after what he did to Mary. Who's Mary? Maylin asked quietly. Another girl who worked there. She tried to leave 2 months ago, and he... Emma stopped, swallowing hard. They found her in the river. Said she must have fallen in. But Mary could swim. She grew up on a farm with a creek running through it. She wouldn't have just fallen. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Cole's expression went hard. You think Hale killed her? I think someone did. And I think if I stay in Riverside, I'll be next. Emma looked between them desperately. I know I have no right to ask, but I heard you stood up to him, that you don't care what people say. And I hoped, maybe you'd help me, just until I can get enough money to go east to my sister in St. Louis. Maylin saw Cole struggle with it, saw him weigh the danger of getting more involved against the impossibility of turning away someone who needed help. You can stay, he said finally. We don't have much, but we've got a spare room and food enough to share. You work for your keep, same as everyone else here. Emma's face crumpled with relief. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Cole said grimly. If Hale finds out you're here, it's going to make everything worse. He'll find out, Maylin said. A town this size, he'll know by tomorrow. Then we deal with it when it happens. Cole looked at Emma. You know anything about ranch work? Some. I grew up on a farm before my parents died. Good enough. Come on, I'll show you where you'll sleep. After Emma was settled in the small storage room they'd cleared out, Cole and Maylin stood in the yard looking at the charred remains of the barn. This is going to bring him down on us hard, Maylin said. I know. We're barely holding on as it is. Adding another person, someone he'll see as property he lost. I know. Cole turned to face her. But what was I supposed to do? Turn her away? Let her end up like Mary? Maylin shook her head. No, you did the right thing. I just want you to understand what it's going to cost. Everything costs something. At least this way we get to choose what we pay for. That night, Maylin lay awake thinking about Mary, about Emma, about all the ways power got used to hurt people who couldn't fight back. She thought about the barn burning and Hale's casual cruelty and the fact that the law wouldn't help them because the law was written by men like Hale. She thought about Cole, who kept making impossible choices because his sense of right and wrong was stronger than his sense of self-preservation. And she thought about herself, about how she'd gone from trying to survive to actually caring what happened next. Somewhere in the past 2 months, this had stopped being a job. This had become something else entirely. The realization should have scared her. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something she'd known for a while but hadn't been ready to admit. She was done running, done being invisible, done accepting that the world got to decide her worth. If Hale wanted a fight, he'd get one. The confrontation came faster than expected. 2 days after Emma arrived, Hale showed up with twice as many men as last time. They rode into the yard like an occupying force, spreading out to cut off all the exits. Maylin was working on the frame of the new barn, barely more than a skeleton at this point, when she saw them coming. She set down her hammer and walked toward the house, where Cole and Emma were organizing supplies. He's here, she said quietly. Cole grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. Emma went pale but followed, staying close to the door. Hale sat his horse like he was posing for a portrait, every inch the righteous landowner defending his property. Maddox, he said, his voice carrying across the yard, I believe you have something that belongs to me. Everything here belongs to me, Cole replied evenly. You're trespassing. Again. The girl. Emma Carter. She's under contract to work at my ranch for another 6 months. I'm here to collect her. Emma made a small sound of fear behind them. She's free to work where she chooses, Cole said, and she chose here. That's not how contracts work. Hale pulled out a piece of paper. I have her signature right here, legally binding. She leaves when I say she leaves. Maylin stepped forward, and she saw several of Hale's men shift nervously. Good. Let them be nervous. Let me see that contract, she said. Hale looked amused. And who are you to make demands? Someone who knows how to read. She held out her hand. If you have a legal document, show it. Hale hesitated just for a moment,
then handed the paper to one of his men to pass down. Mei Lin took it and read quickly, her eyes scanning for the details that mattered. This contract specifies room, board, and wages of $3 per week, she said. Emma, were you paid? No, Emma said, her voice shaking. He said I had to work off my parents' debt first. That's not in the contract. Mei Lin looked up at Hale. This document specifies payment. If you didn't pay her, you broke the contract first, which means she's free to leave. Hale's pleasant expression cracked. That's not how it works. The debt isn't mentioned in this contract. You want to claim she owes you money, you need to provide documentation of that debt. Otherwise, this is just a piece of paper you're using to justify keeping someone against their will. The silence that followed was dangerous. One of Hale's men, the one called Jake, leaned forward. You calling Mr. Hale a liar? I'm calling his contract invalid, Mei Lin said calmly. There's a difference. Hale's face went hard. This is your doing, Maddox, hiding behind a China woman and using technicalities to steal my workers. It's pathetic. What's pathetic is a man who has to threaten girls half his age to feel powerful, Cole said, his voice going cold. Emma's staying. You want to challenge that legally? Go ahead. But you're not taking her off this property. For a moment, Mei Lin thought Hale was going to order his men to attack. She could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the weighing of whether he could get away with violence here and now. Then he smiled, and it was worse than anger. Fine, he said. Keep her. But you're making a mistake, Maddox. You think you're protecting people, but all you're doing is painting a target on your back. And when everything you have burns down around you, and it will, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. He wheeled his horse around and rode out, his men following. But Mei Lin noticed that two of them stayed behind, positioning themselves on the ridge overlooking the ranch, watching. They're not leaving, Emma whispered. No, Cole agreed. They're not. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Mei Lin took the first shift, sitting on the porch with Cole's rifle across her lap, watching the shadows for movement. Around midnight, Cole came out to relieve her. Can't sleep? She asked. Can't stop thinking. He sat down beside her. I keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing, putting you and Emma in danger for the sake of principle. The right thing usually is dangerous, Mei Lin said. That's how you know it matters. Cole was quiet for a moment. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to know the difference between surviving and living. She looked at him in the darkness. You gave me back the ability to do the second one. I won't let Hale take that away. Mei Lin? Cole stopped, struggling with something. I need to tell you something. Before this gets any worse, before... He took a breath. You matter to me. More than I expected. More than I was ready for. And if something happens, if Hale makes good on his threats, I need you to know that. Mei Lin felt her heart do something complicated and painful in her chest. She was 55 years old. Too old for this. Too practical for this. But she felt it anyway. Cole? A shout from the direction of the barn cut her off. They both jumped up, grabbing weapons, and ran toward the sound. Emma was already there, pointing at something in the darkness. Fire. Again. But this time it was smaller, contained. Someone had tried to set the new barn frame alight, but the green wood wasn't catching properly. It was smoking more than burning. And there, running toward the ridge where Hale's men had been watching, was a figure in dark clothes. Cole raised his rifle, but Mei Lin put her hand on the barrel. Don't. We can't prove who sent him, and killing him just gives Hale ammunition. So we do nothing? We put out the fire, we rebuild, and we start documenting everything. Mei Lin's mind was already working. Every threat, every attack, every visit, we write it all down with dates and witnesses. And when Hale finally goes too far, and he will, we have evidence. Cole looked at her like she'd just proposed something impossible. Then slowly, he nodded. All right, we do it your way. They spent the rest of the night putting out the fire and salvaging what they could. The damage was minimal this time, smoke and char, but nothing structural. As dawn broke, Mei Lin stood looking at the scorched wood and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent 30 years avoiding conflict, staying invisible, accepting whatever the world decided she was worth. She was done with that. Hale wanted a war? He was going to get one. but not the kind he expected. The next week was tense. Hale's men stayed on the ridge, watching constantly. Small things started going wrong. Fences cut in the night, cattle spooked and scattered, tools disappearing from where they'd been left. Nothing major enough to be definitive. Everything just troublesome enough to be exhausting. But Mei Lin documented it all. She wrote down every incident, every time they saw Hale's men watching, every threat made in town when Cole went for supplies. She kept the records hidden and detailed, building a case piece by piece. Emma helped. She knew things about Hale's operation, where he kept his records, which of his men could be turned with the right pressure, how he covered his tracks. She was smart and observant, and Mei Lin realized the girl had been planning her escape for months. Mary tried to gather evidence too, Emma told them one night. She had a journal where she wrote down everything Hale did, everyone he hurt, but it disappeared after she died. I think he found it.
Did she tell anyone else what she knew? Mei Lin asked. She mentioned talking to someone in town, someone she thought might help, but she never said who. Cole and Mei Lin exchanged glances. It wasn't much, but it was something. 3 weeks after the second fire, Cole went into town for supplies and came back with news. There's a federal marshal coming through next month, he said. He's investigating corruption in the county land office. If we can get evidence to him, real evidence, not just our word, he might actually listen. That's a big if, Emma said nervously. It's the only chance we have, Mei Lin countered. Hale owns the local law, but he can't buy federal authority as easily. So we have a month to build a case that will convince a marshal that one of the most powerful men in the county is a murderer and a criminal. Cole ran a hand through his hair. No pressure. They worked furiously. Mei Lin reached out to other people in town who might have been hurt by Hale, carefully, quietly, testing who could be trusted. She found more than she expected. Families who'd lost land to suspicious foreclosures, workers who'd been cheated of wages, women who'd left Hale's employment under questionable circumstances. Everyone was afraid to speak publicly, but several were willing to write statements to provide documentation if they could remain anonymous. Cole focused on the physical evidence, tracking property damage back to Hale's men, documenting the pattern of harassment, building a timeline that showed clear intent. Emma became their secret weapon. She knew the inside of Hale's operation, and she helped them understand how he covered his tracks, where the weak points were in his network of influence. And slowly, carefully, they built something that looked like a case. But Hale wasn't idle either. One morning, Mei Lin went out to check on the cattle and found one of them dead in the field, its throat cut. A message, clear and simple. Another night, someone fired shots into the air near the house, close enough to shatter a window, but not close enough to claim they were actually trying to hit anyone. The pressure was constant, grinding, designed to break them down bit by bit. Cole started sleeping with his rifle. Emma jumped at every sound. And Mei Lin felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. These people had been fine before she arrived, and now they were in danger because she'd convinced them to fight. Late one night, as she was writing up their latest documentation, Cole found her at the kitchen table. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." He sat down across from her. "Mei Lin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." She set down her pen. "All right, if you could go back to that day in town before I bought you off that block, would you make a different choice? Would you take the money and run instead of coming here?" Mei Lin thought about it, really thought about it. She thought about the fear and the exhaustion and the constant danger. She thought about her blistered hands and her aching back and the very real possibility that Hale would find a way to destroy them all. Then she thought about the sunrise over the fields, about the satisfaction of fixing something broken, about Cole's rare smile and Emma's gratitude, and the strange, fragile community they'd built in the ruins of everyone's expectations. "No," she said finally, "I wouldn't change it. Even knowing what it would cost? Especially knowing that." She met his eyes. "Because the alternative was dying slowly while still breathing. This is living. Even if it's dangerous and hard and probably stupid, it's living. And I'm done apologizing for that." Cole reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses that matched her own, his grip solid and warm. "Marry me," he said. Mei Lin froze. "What?" "Marry me." He said it again, stronger this time. I know it's crazy. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I'm tired of pretending this is just about the ranch or survival or making a point. You matter to me, Maylin. You matter more than I thought anyone could matter again. And if Hale's going to try to destroy me anyway, I want to at least be honest about what I'm fighting for. She stared at him, her heart pounding. Cole, I'm 55 years old. I'm Chinese. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You're brilliant and brave, and you don't back down from anything. And you make me want to be better than I am. He squeezed her hand. I don't care what people think. I haven't cared about that for a while now, but I care what you think. So, will you marry me? Maylin felt tears she hadn't cried in years burning behind her eyes. Every practical part of her brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea, that it would make everything worse, that she was too old, too different, too much of a liability. But there was another voice, quieter but stronger, that said, when has playing it safe ever gotten you anything worth having? Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I'll marry you. Cole's face broke into a smile so genuine it made him look 10 years younger. He stood and pulled her into his arms, and Maylin let herself lean into him, let herself feel this impossible thing that was happening. Behind them, neither of them noticed Emma standing in the doorway, smiling through her own tears. Outside on the ridge, Hale's men kept watching, and the countdown to the marshal's arrival continued. They got married 3 days later in the ranch house kitchen with Emma as their only witness. There was no minister, no fancy dress, no guests bringing gifts and well wishes. Just Cole and Maylin standing in front of the table where they'd shared countless meals, speaking vows they'd written themselves in the quiet hours before dawn. I promise to stand with you, Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. To fight beside you, to share what I have, to never make you feel less than what you are. And I promise to keep trying, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Maylin's hands trembled slightly as she held his. She'd never expected this. Never imagined at 55, after everything she'd lost and survived, that someone would look at her the way Cole was looking at her now. I promise to work beside you, she said. To tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable. To never give up on what we're building here. And I promise to remember that we chose this, chose each other, and that choice means something. Emma cried openly as they exchanged the simple gold bands Cole had traded his pocket watch for in town. The rings were scratched and worn, probably pulled from a pawn shop bin. But when Cole slipped the band onto Maylin's finger, it felt like the most precious thing she'd ever owned. They kissed, awkward and brief and real, and Emma clapped her hands together like she was witnessing something magical, instead of two exhausted people making promises they might not live long enough to keep. You're married, Emma said wonderingly. You actually did it. We actually did, Cole agreed and pulled Maylin close against his side. She let herself lean into him just for a moment before the practical parts of her brain started cataloging everything they still needed to do. But that moment was enough. The news spread through Riverside faster than the barn fire had. When Cole went into town 2 days later for supplies, he came back with a black eye and split knuckles. He didn't talk about what happened, just unloaded the wagon in grim silence while Maylin cleaned his wounds at the kitchen table. Who was it? She asked quietly. Does it matter? Yes. Cole sighed. 3 different people. First was Jake, one of Hale's men, said some things about you I won't repeat. I hit him. He hit back. Someone broke it up before it got worse. He flexed his hand carefully. Then Martha Cunningham got in my face outside the general store. Said I'd disgrace my wife's memory, that Sarah would be ashamed of what I'd become. Maylin's jaw tightened, but she kept cleaning his knuckles. And the third? Reverend Thomas. He was more polite about it, but the message was the same. What we did was wrong, sinful, an abomination against the natural order. Cole laughed bitterly. The natural order. Like there's anything natural about how this town operates. Did you get the supplies we needed? Most of them? Henderson refused to sell to me, said he doesn't do business with people who... Cole stopped. I went to the other store, paid more, but I got what we needed. Maylin finished bandaging his hand and sat back. It's going to get worse before it gets better. I know. People are going to keep coming at us, keep trying to make us break. I know that too. Cole met her eyes.
You regretting it already? No. She said it firmly, but I want you to understand what you've done. You didn't just marry me, Cole. You declared war on this whole town's way of thinking, and they won't forgive that easily. Good. I don't want their forgiveness. He caught her hand, careful of his bandaged knuckles. I want them to see that they're wrong, that you're worth 10 of any of them. And if they can't see that, then they can go to hell. Emma, who'd been pretending not to listen from across the room, spoke up quietly. The marshal arrives in 2 weeks. If we can hold out until then, we'll hold out, Maylin said with more confidence than she felt. We have to. But holding out proved harder than any of them anticipated. The harassment intensified. Fences were cut almost nightly. Cattle were driven off their land onto Hale's property. Then Cole was threatened with theft charges for trying to retrieve his own animals. Someone poisoned their well. Not enough to kill, but enough to make the water taste foul and suspect. They dug a new well by hand, back-breaking work in the drought-hardened soil. They repaired fences until their hands bled. They took turns staying up all night to guard the property, sleeping in shifts, running on coffee, and stubborn determination. And through it all, they kept building their case. Maylin made contact with a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Cole's late wife, who ran a small boarding house on the edge of town. Sarah was older, maybe 60, and she'd lived in Riverside long enough to know where all the bodies were buried, literally, in some cases. Mary wasn't the first girl to disappear, Sarah told Maylin quietly, meeting her behind the boarding house where no one would see them talking. There was another one, 3 years ago, Rebecca Stone. She worked for the Hales too. One day she was there, the next she was gone. Hale said she'd run off with a traveling salesman, but Rebecca's sister never believed it. She tried to investigate, tried to make noise about it, but Sarah shrugged helplessly. Hale has too much power. Eventually the sister gave up and moved away. Do you know where the sister went? Denver, I think, but I don't know how you'd find her. Maylin filed the information away. What about the land office? Emma said there were suspicious foreclosures. Sarah's expression darkened. More than suspicious. Tom Wilson owned a good piece of land north of Hale's property. He fell behind on payments during a bad year. Happens to everyone. But when he tried to catch up, the bank said his payments had never been recorded. They foreclosed and sold the land to Hale for a fraction of what it was worth. Do you think Wilson would testify? He might. He's bitter enough about it. Sarah paused. But you should know, people are scared. Hale has a long reach and a longer memory. Anyone who speaks against him is taking a real risk. I know, Maylin said. But sometimes the risk of staying silent is worse. She gathered names, stories, fragments of evidence. Cole tracked down property records and compared them to foreclosure notices, finding patterns of manipulation that were obvious once you knew to look. Emma wrote out everything she remembered about Hale's operation, the threats she'd witnessed, the women who'd left crying, the times she'd heard Hale talking about people like they were problems to be eliminated. They had pieces, but they needed something concrete, something undeniable. That something came from an unexpected source. A week before the marshal was due to arrive, a young man showed up at the ranch just after sunset. He was thin and nervous, couldn't have been more than 20, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected to be followed. My name's Peter Grant, he said when Cole answered the door with his rifle. I'm the county inspector's nephew. I need to talk to you about Victor Hale. They brought him inside carefully, checking to make sure he hadn't been followed. Emma made coffee while Peter sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly. My Uncle Theodore, the inspector who came here, he's a good man, Peter said. He tries to be fair, but Hale has leverage on him. Nothing terrible, just enough. Enough to make Uncle Theodore file reports the way Hale wants them filed. What kind of leverage? Maylin asked. Uncle Theodore has a gambling debt, not huge by most standards, but more than he can pay on a county salary. Hale bought the debt, and he's been using it to control the inspection reports. Making sure properties Hale wants get condemned, making sure properties Hale owns get approved, even when they shouldn't. Cole's expression went hard. So the inspection we passed, you earned that one fair and square, Peter interrupted. Uncle Theodore was actually impressed with what you'd done here. But Hale wanted him to fail you anyway, and Uncle Theodore refused. That's why I'm here. He's trying to do the right thing, but he's scared. And I thought maybe if someone could help him, if there was a way out of this, We're building a case against Hale, Maylin said, for the federal marshal. If your uncle would testify about the corruption, he'd lose his job. Maybe worse. Maybe, Maylin agreed, or maybe he'd finally be free of Hale's control, and maybe his testimony would help bring down a man who's hurt a lot of people. Peter looked torn. I'd have to talk to him. Talk to him, Cole said. But do it soon. We've got 1 week before the marshal arrives, and we need all the evidence we can get. Peter left as quietly as he'd arrived, and they sat in tense silence after he was gone. Do you think he'll do it? Emma asked. The uncle? I don't know, Maylin said honestly. People make different choices when they're scared. We'll have to wait and see. But waiting had never been Maylin's strong suit, and the following days felt like torture. They continued their work, rebuilding, documenting, preparing, but the uncertainty ate at her. 5 days before the marshal was due to arrive, Hale made his boldest move yet. Maylin was working on the barn frame when she saw the dust cloud approaching. Not riders this time. A wagon. An official-looking wagon with county markings. Cole emerged from the house, his face going pale when he saw what was coming. That's the sheriff, he said quietly. The wagon pulled up, and 2 men got down. One was Sheriff Morrison, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a badge that gleamed in the sun. The other was someone Maylin didn't recognize, thin, well-dressed, carrying a leather case. Mr. Maddox, the sheriff said, his voice carefully neutral. This is Mr. Patterson from the county clerk's office. He has some papers for you. Patterson pulled out a document and handed it to Cole. You're being served with a warrant of seizure. Due to outstanding debts and failure to maintain property standards, this ranch is being foreclosed and will be auctioned to satisfy creditor claims. Cole's hand shook as he read the document. This is impossible. I don't have outstanding debts, and we passed the property inspection. According to our records, you owe $300 in back taxes and fees, Patterson said smoothly. And there have been multiple complaints about livestock management and property maintenance. That's a lie. Cole's voice went dangerous. I paid my taxes in full, and the complaints are fabricated. Nevertheless, the law is clear. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Maylin stepped forward, taking the document from Cole's shaking hands. She read it quickly, her mind racing through the legal language. This is dated yesterday, she said, but it references an inspection that supposedly happened last week. The inspection we actually passed happened 6 weeks ago, and we have documentation of that. Patterson's expression didn't change. I don't know what documentation you think you have, but this is the official county record. The official county record is falsified. Maylin kept her voice calm, even though rage was burning through her veins. And if you proceed with this seizure based on false documents, you'll be complicit in fraud. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Now, ma'am, those are serious accusations. And this is a serious crime. She looked at both men. We have evidence. Documented evidence of harassment, property damage, and corruption. And in 5 days, a federal marshal is coming through this county. I wonder what he'll think when he sees forged inspection reports and fraudulent foreclosure notices. Patterson's jaw tightened. Are you threatening a county official? I'm informing you of facts. What you do with those facts is your choice. Maylin handed the document back. But we're not leaving. Not in 72 hours, not ever. If you want us off this land, you'll have to drag us off. And I guarantee that will make a very interesting story when the marshal arrives. Patterson and the sheriff exchanged glances. Finally, Patterson said, This isn't over. The law will be enforced. Then enforce it legally, Cole said, finding his voice again. But because this document isn't worth the paper it's printed on. They left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. That night, Maylin, Cole, and Emma spread all their evidence across the kitchen table. Documents, testimonies, records, everything they'd gathered over the past weeks. It's not enough, Emma said quietly. Even if the marshal believes us, Hale will just claim we're lying. It's our word against his. Not quite, Cole said. He pulled out a ledger he'd been keeping, a detailed log of every incident, every threat, every piece of damage done to the property. I've got dates, times, descriptions, and we have witnesses. Witnesses who are afraid to speak publicly, Emma pointed out. Maylin stared at the papers, her mind working. They needed something undeniable, something Hale couldn't explain away. The well, she said suddenly, the one that was poisoned. Did you keep samples of the water? Cole nodded. I've got 2 jars in the cellar. Figured if anyone got sick, we'd need proof it wasn't just bad maintenance. And the can of kerosene from the first barn fire. Do you still have it? It's in the shed. Why? Because those things can be tested, and if we can prove they came from Hale's property, that the kerosene matches what he uses, that the poison in the water is the same chemical he uses on his fields, then we have physical evidence, not just testimony. Emma sat up straighter. That could work, but how do we test it, and how do we prove where it came from? The marshal will have access to resources we don't, Maylin said. If we present him with the materials and the context, if we show him the pattern, he'll have to investigate. He won't have a choice. Cole was nodding slowly. It's risky. If we're wrong about any of it, we're not wrong, Maylin said firmly. I've spent 30 years reading people, reading situations. Hale is arrogant. He doesn't think anyone will challenge him seriously enough to gather real evidence. That arrogance is his weakness. They spent the rest of the night organizing everything into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore. By dawn, they had something that looked less like desperate accusations and more like a legitimate case. But they were exhausted, running on fumes and determination, and they all knew the hardest part was still coming. The next day, Peter Grant returned with news that made everything more complicated. My uncle will testify, he said, but he wants protection. He's afraid Hale will come after him or his family. The marshal can offer protection, Cole said, if he takes the case seriously. And if he doesn't, Peter's voice was tight with worry. Then we make him take it seriously, Maylin said. She looked at the young man. Tell your uncle we understand his fear. Tell him he's not alone in this. And tell him that sometimes doing the right thing is the scariest thing there is, but that doesn't make it any less right. Peter nodded and left, and Maylin felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. These people were trusting her, following her lead, and if she was wrong, if the marshal didn't listen or didn't care, they would all pay the price. 2 days before the marshal's arrival, everything came to a head. Maylin was in town, carefully purchasing supplies from the one store that would still serve them, when she saw a commotion outside the sheriff's office. A woman was arguing with Morrison, her voice carrying across the street. It was Rebecca Stone's sister. She'd come back to Riverside. Maylin finished her transaction quickly and approached carefully. The woman, she introduced herself as Catherine Stone, was furious and frightened in equal measure. I want to report a crime, Catherine was saying. My sister didn't run away, she was murdered, and I have proof. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, we investigated your sister's disappearance 3 years ago. You covered it up, Catherine's voice cracked. I have her journal. She mailed it to me a week before she disappeared, and I've spent 3 years trying to find the courage to come back here. But I can't stay quiet anymore. Not when other girls are going through the same thing. She pulled out a small leather-bound book, and Maylin's heart started pounding. Rebecca wrote everything down, Catherine continued. Every threat Hale made, every girl who disappeared or left in the middle of the night. She documented it all because she knew something was wrong. And then she sent it to me for safekeeping, and a week later she was gone. Morrison reached for the journal. I'll need to take this as evidence. No. Catherine pulled it back. I'm giving it to the federal marshal who's coming through here. I heard he's investigating corruption, and this is corruption. This is murder covered up by people who were supposed to protect us. Maylin stepped forward. Catherine Stone? The woman turned, her eyes wary. Who are you? My name is Maylin Maddox. My husband and I are also gathering evidence against Victor Hale, and I think we should talk. They met that evening at Sarah Chen's boarding house, away from prying eyes. Catherine's journal was damning, page after page of documented abuse, threats, and suspicious disappearances. Rebecca had been smart and observant, and she'd seen the pattern long before anyone else had the courage to name it. She was going to go to the county prosecutor, Catherine said, her voice thick with grief. She had all this evidence, and she actually believed, that someone would care, that someone would stop him. Someone will, Maylin said firmly. The marshal arrives tomorrow. We're presenting him with everything we have, and your sister's journal will be part of that. Rebecca's courage won't be wasted. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Do you really think it will make a difference? Maylin thought about all the times she'd been told nothing would make a difference, all the times she'd been dismissed, ignored, erased. And she thought about standing on that auction block and feeling like her life was over, only to have Cole Maddox prove that one person's choice could change everything. "Yes," she said, "I really do." The night before the marshal arrived, Maylin couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Cole, listening to him breathe, thinking about everything that could go wrong. "You're awake," Cole said quietly in the darkness. "Can't turn my brain off." He rolled over to face her. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing. What happens if the marshal doesn't believe us? What happens if Hale finds out what we're planning before we can present our case? What happens if—" She stopped. "What happens if I've led us all into something we can't survive?" Cole took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. That's what we promised, remember? To stand with each other, especially when it's hard." "I know, but I keep thinking about Emma, about Catherine, about your Uncle Theodore, all these people who are trusting us to make this work. And what if I'm wrong? What if I'm not as smart as I think I am? What if—" Cole kissed her, gentle and grounding. When he pulled back, his voice was firm. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, the smartest, the bravest. And even if everything goes wrong tomorrow, even if we lose everything, I won't regret any of this. Because you gave me back something I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" "Hope." He said it simply. "You made me believe that fighting was worth it, that standing up mattered, that I could be more than just a broken man going through the motions. So whatever happens, I want you to know you changed my life, and I'm grateful for every minute of it." Maylin felt tears sliding down her face. She'd spent so much of her life believing she didn't deserve good things, didn't deserve love or happiness or second chances. But here was Cole Maddox, scarred and stubborn and impossibly kind, telling her she'd changed his life. Maybe she had, and maybe he'd changed hers too. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it felt terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Cole's smile was visible even in the darkness. "I love you too." They held each other in the quiet hours before dawn, gathering strength for whatever was coming. And when the sun rose on the day the marshal was set to arrive, Maylin Maddox got out of bed, braided her gray-streaked hair, and prepared to fight for the life she'd built from ashes. She was done being invisible. She was done being silent, and she was done letting powerful men decide her worth. Whatever happened next, she would face it standing up. The marshal arrived at noon in a dust-covered carriage that looked like it had traveled through every hard mile between here and the capital. Maylin watched from the porch as he stepped down, a tall man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of the world to be permanently skeptical. He wore his authority quietly, without the need for display, and that gave her the first real spark of hope she'd felt in days. His name was James Cartwright, and he set up in the town hall with the kind of efficiency that suggested he'd done this dozens of times before. Word spread fast. The marshal was hearing complaints, taking testimonies, reviewing evidence. Anyone with grievances about county corruption should present themselves before sunset. Cole, Maylin, and Emma gathered their materials carefully. The documents, the water samples, the kerosene can, Rebecca's journal that Catherine had entrusted to them the night before. Everything organized, everything labeled, everything ready to present in a way that couldn't be dismissed. "You ready for this?" Cole asked as they loaded everything into the wagon. Maylin looked at him, at Emma standing nervous but determined beside the house, at the ranch they'd fought so hard to keep. "No, but we're doing it anyway." They weren't the first to arrive at the town hall. A line had already formed, people Maylin recognized and some she didn't. Tom Wilson was there, the man who'd lost his land to Hale's foreclosure scheme. Sarah Chen stood near the back, clutching papers. And there, looking terrified but resolute, was Theodore Grant with his nephew Peter beside him. Hale was there too, of course. He stood near the front with his lawyer, a slick man named Whitmore, who had a reputation for making inconvenient legal problems disappear. They were talking quietly, confidently, like this was just another day of managing their empire. When Hale saw Maylin, his expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, reassessment. He hadn't expected her to get this far. The marshal called people in one at a time, and the wait was excruciating. Maylin watched people go in and come out, trying to read their faces for clues. Some looked relieved. Others looked like they'd been dismissed. Tom Wilson came out angry. He listened, he said to no one in particular. Actually listened and took notes. But whether he'll do anything about it, he shrugged helplessly and walked away. Theodore Grant emerged looking pale but steadier than when he'd gone in. He caught Maylin's eye and gave a small nod. He'd done it. He'd testified. Finally, after what felt like hours, the marshal's assistant called. Cole and Maylin Maddox. They gathered their materials and walked into the room. It was stark and official, just a table and chairs and the marshal sitting with his papers spread before him. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. Mr. and Mrs. Maddox, he said, gesturing to the chairs across from him. I've been hearing interesting things about you. Please, sit. They sat, and Maylin felt Cole's knee press against hers under the table, grounding, supportive. I understand you have allegations regarding Victor Hale, Cartwright said. Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. I've been investigating corruption in this county for 6 weeks now. I've heard a lot of complaints, most of them personal grudges dressed up as crimes. So if you're here to waste my time, tell me now, and we can skip the performance. Maylin met his eyes steadily. We're not here to waste your time. We're here because Victor Hale has been using his power to terrorize, manipulate, and possibly murder people who get in his way. And we have evidence. Cartwright's eyebrow raised slightly. That's a serious accusation. Let's see this evidence. They spent the next hour presenting their case. Cole went through the timeline of harassment, the barn fires, the poisoned well, the cut fences, the cattle driven onto Hale's land and then used as evidence of poor management. He showed the ledger he'd kept, detailed and dated. Maylin presented the financial documentation, the foreclosure notices that didn't match property records, the inspection reports that contradicted actual inspections, the pattern of land acquisitions that always seemed to benefit Hale at impossibly convenient moments. Emma testified about what she'd witnessed working in Hale's household, the threats, the intimidation, the girls who'd left frightened or disappeared entirely, and then Maylin placed Rebecca's journal on the table. This belonged to Rebecca Stone, she said quietly. She worked for Hale 3 years ago. She documented everything she saw, abuse, threats, suspicious circumstances surrounding other workers who'd left or disappeared. She mailed this journal to her sister for safekeeping 1 week before she allegedly drowned in the river. Rebecca Stone could swim. She grew up on a farm with water, and yet the official report says she fell in accidentally. Cartwright picked up the journal and read in silence for several long minutes. His expression didn't change, but Maylin saw his jaw tighten. This is compelling, he said finally, but it's also 3 years old. Do you have anything more recent? We have Theodore Grant's testimony about the corruption in the inspection system, Cole said. We have Tom Wilson's documentation of the fraudulent foreclosure. We have physical evidence, he gestured to the water samples and kerosene can, that we believe will match materials from Hale's property if tested properly. And we have this. Maylin pulled out the falsified foreclosure notice that had been served on them. This document claims to reference an inspection that never happened. The dates don't match county records, and the supposed violations directly contradict the actual inspection report filed by Mr. Grant. Someone in the county clerk's office fabricated this, and we believe they did it at Hale's direction. Cartwright examined the document carefully, comparing it to notes he'd already taken. This is the same clerk's office that's been involved in several other questionable land transfers. I've been building a case there for weeks. He looked up at them. What is it you want from me? Justice, Maylin said simply. We want the harassment to stop. We want the people Hale has hurt to see him held accountable. And we want to know that what happened to Rebecca Stone and Mary Carter and all the other women who've disappeared won't just be swept under the rug because Hale has money and power. That's a lot to want, Cartwright said, but there was something different in his voice now, something that sounded like respect. We know it won't fix everything, Cole added. We know even if you investigate, even if you find wrongdoing, it might not result in criminal charges. Men like Hale are good at covering their tracks, but at minimum, we want it on record. We want people to know the truth. Cartwright was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm going to be honest with you. What you've presented here is concerning, disturbing even. But building a federal case against someone like Victor Hale takes time and resources and ironclad evidence. Physical evidence that can be tested and verified, witnesses willing to testify in court, documentation that will hold up under scrutiny from expensive lawyers. Maylin felt her heart sink. This was the dismissal she'd been afraid of, dressed up in sympathetic language. But then Cartwright continued, "However, I believe you. I believe Hale is corrupt, and I believe he's been using his position to hurt people. And I'm going to investigate, properly and thoroughly, starting with these water samples and this kerosene can, which I'll send to a federal laboratory for analysis. And I'll be interviewing everyone you've mentioned, under federal protection if necessary." Hope flared so suddenly in Maylin's chest it hurt. "What does that mean?" Cole asked carefully. "In practical terms, it means Hale is now under federal investigation. It means any further harassment against you or anyone else who's cooperated with this inquiry will be considered witness intimidation, which is a federal crime. And it means I'll be staying in Riverside until I get to the bottom of this, however long that takes." Cartwright leaned forward. "It also means you three need to be careful. Hale is going to know you're behind this, and he's going to be angry. Federal investigation or not, desperate men do desperate things." "We've been careful for months," Maylin said. "We'll keep being careful." Cartwright nodded. "I'll need you to make formal statements, all three of you, and I'll need to visit your property to document the damage you've described. Can you make yourselves available tomorrow morning?" "Absolutely," Cole said. They left the town hall feeling lighter than they had in weeks, but the relief was tempered by Cartwright's warning. As they loaded back into the wagon, Maylin saw Hale watching from across the street. His face was calm, but she could read the fury underneath. "He knows," Emma whispered. "Let him know," Maylin said. "We're done being afraid of him." But that night, as they sat around the kitchen table reviewing what had happened, the fear crept back in despite her brave words. "Cartwright was right," Cole said. "Hale's going to retaliate, and probably soon before the investigation gets too far along to stop." "So we prepare," Maylin replied. "We document everything, we stay alert, and we don't give him any opportunity to claim we did something wrong." Emma looked between them. "What if he doesn't care about doing it legally anymore? What if he just—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Then we defend ourselves," Cole said grimly. "I've got the rifle, and I'm not afraid to use it if he brings violence to our door." They took turns on watch again that night, just like they had during the worst of the harassment. But this time felt different. This time they weren't just surviving, they were fighting back with the weight of federal authority behind them. Maylin took the midnight shift sitting on the porch with Cole's rifle across her lap. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like someone had spilled salt. She thought about how far she'd come from that auction block, from the moment when she'd believed her life was over. She thought about Cole sleeping inside, about Emma in the spare room, about all the people in town who were hoping, maybe for the first time, that someone with power actually cared about justice. And she thought about the future, about what came after Hale, after the investigation, after all of this was resolved one way or another. The sound of hoofbeats jerked her from her thoughts. She stood quickly, raising the rifle, her heart pounding. But as the rider came into view in the moonlight, she saw it was Peter Grant, riding hard and fast. He pulled up in front of the house, breathing hard. "Mrs. Maddox, you need to come quick. My uncle's house is on fire." Maylin's blood went cold. She ran inside and woke Cole, and within minutes they were in the wagon racing toward town with Peter leading the way. They could see the flames before they reached Theodore Grant's house, orange and terrible against the night sky. A crowd had gathered, but no one was doing much to fight the fire. It had already consumed most of the small home. Theodore stood in the street, his wife beside him, both of them in their nightclothes. They'd gotten out, thank everything, but they'd lost their home, and everyone knew why. The sheriff was there, making a show of investigating, but Maylin saw the way he avoided looking at Theodore directly. Morrison knew exactly what this was, retaliation for testifying, but he wasn't going to say it out loud. Cole walked over to Theodore and his wife. "You can stay with us, both of you, for as long as you need." Theodore's wife started crying, and Theodore himself looked too shocked to respond, but Peter answered for them.
Thank you.
We'll get their things, what's left of them, and bring them out in the morning. Mei Lin stayed silent, watching the fire burn, watching the crowd whisper and point. This was Hale's message, clear and brutal. This is what happens when you cross me. But as she looked around at the faces in the crowd, she saw something else too. She saw anger. She saw people who'd been quietly afraid for years starting to realize they didn't have to be quiet anymore. Sarah Chen caught her eye and gave a small nod. Tom Wilson stood with his arms crossed, his expression dark. Catherine Stone was there too, her hand clutched around her sister's journal like a weapon. Hale had overplayed his hand. He'd made it too obvious, too cruel, and he'd done it the same night a federal marshal had opened an investigation into his activities. This wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. The next morning, Marshal Cartwright showed up at Theodore Grant's burned-out house before the ashes were even cool. He walked through the ruins with a federal deputy, taking notes, asking questions. When Sheriff Morrison tried to insist it was just an accident, a lamp knocked over, purely unfortunate, Cartwright looked at him with such cold contempt that Morrison actually took a step back. "This is witness intimidation," Cartwright said flatly. "And if I find out you had any knowledge this was going to happen, Sheriff, you'll be facing federal charges right alongside whoever set this fire." Morrison paled. "I had nothing to do with this. Then I suggest you start investigating like you mean it, because I'm going to be watching very closely." Cartwright came out to the ranch that afternoon to take formal statements and document the damage from the previous fires. He spent 3 hours examining everything, photographing the burned barn timbers, collecting samples, asking detailed questions. "This is extensive," he said finally, "and the pattern is clear. This wasn't random vandalism or bad luck. This was systematic harassment designed to force you off your property." "Can you prove it was Hale?" Cole asked. "Not yet, but I will." Cartwright's voice was firm. "Men like him always make mistakes. They get arrogant, sloppy, and when they do, I'll be there to catch them." Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation intensified. Cartwright interviewed dozens of people, many of them coming forward now that they saw someone was actually taking Hale's crimes seriously. The laboratory results came back on the water samples. They contained arsenic consistent with agricultural pesticide, the same type used on Hale's fields. The kerosene can had fingerprints that matched one of Hale's ranch hands. It wasn't enough for a murder charge, but it was enough to prove the harassment. And combined with the evidence of corruption in the county offices, it was enough to start unraveling Hale's empire. The county clerk who'd filed the falsified foreclosure notice cracked first. Faced with federal charges, he admitted Hale had paid him to manipulate property records. Then one of Hale's ranch hands, the one whose fingerprints were on the kerosene can, turned on him in exchange for a lighter sentence. He testified that Hale had ordered both barn fires and the well poisoning. The walls were closing in. 3 weeks after the marshal's arrival, Hale was arrested. Not for murder, they couldn't prove that yet, but for witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit arson, corruption of public officials, and fraud. Mei Lin was in town when it happened. She watched from across the street as federal deputies led Hale out of his ranch house in handcuffs. His wife stood on the porch, pale and silent. His lawyer was already there, shouting about unlawful arrest and insufficient evidence, but Hale himself was quiet. He looked across the street and locked eyes with Mei Lin, and for a moment they just stared at each other. The powerful man who'd thought he was untouchable, and the woman he'd tried to break. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just looked at him steadily, letting him see that she was still standing. Then the deputies put him in the carriage and drove away. The town erupted. Some people were outraged, insisting Hale was innocent and this was federal overreach, but more people, far more than Mei Lin had expected, were relieved, grateful, finally willing to admit what they'd known all along. Sarah Chen found Mei Lin outside the general store. "You did this," she said quietly. "You made this happen." "We all did it," Mei Lin corrected, "everyone who was brave enough to speak up. But you started it. You refused to be silent." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Thank you." Over the following months, the truth kept emerging. Hale's financial records revealed years of fraudulent land deals. More women came forward with stories of abuse and threats. And then, in a grim twist, a construction crew working on one of Hale's properties found remains buried in a field. Remains that dental records eventually identified as Rebecca Stone. It wasn't the river that killed her. It was a bullet to the back of the head. Hale was charged with murder. His lawyer fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. Between the forensics, the testimonies, and the pattern of behavior documented in Rebecca's journal, the prosecution built a case that even money couldn't dismantle. The trial was set for the following spring. Through it all, life on the ranch continued. Cole and May Lynn rebuilt the barn, properly this time, with materials they could actually afford now that the harassment had stopped and they weren't constantly repairing damage. Theodore Grant and his wife stayed with them through the winter, and Theodore found new work as an independent inspector, free from Hale's control. Emma saved enough money to go east to her sister, but before she left, she helped them plant a garden in memory of Mary and Rebecca. 2 oak saplings, small now, but with the potential to grow strong. They deserved better, Emma said as they patted dirt around the roots. They deserve to be remembered. They will be, May Lynn promised. We'll make sure of it. The seasons turned. Fall gave way to winter, and winter slowly yielded to spring. The drought finally broke with a series of storms that turned the dry earth muddy and filled the creeks to overflowing. The ranch came back to life, grass growing green, cattle putting on weight, everything breathing easier. And through it all, May Lynn felt something changing inside herself too. The hardness she'd carried for 30 years, the armor she'd built against a world that didn't want her, it started to soften. Not disappear, because you didn't survive what she'd survived by being soft, but it became less necessary. She had a home now, a real home, not just a place she was allowed to work. She had a husband who looked at her like she was remarkable. She had friends who respected her. She had standing in a community that had once tried to sell her like livestock. She belonged. One morning in late March, May Lynn woke up feeling strange. Not sick exactly, but different, off balance in a way she couldn't immediately identify. She ignored it and went about her day. But the feeling persisted, and when she started getting dizzy while working in the barn, Cole insisted she sit down. "You're pale," he said, concerned. "Maybe you should rest." "I don't need rest. I need to finish." But another wave of dizziness hit her, and she had to grab his arm to stay upright. Cole helped her back to the house and made her lie down. "I'm getting the doctor." "Don't be ridiculous. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're dizzy and pale, and you've barely eaten for 3 days. I'm getting the doctor." He rode into town despite her protests, and an hour later returned with Dr. Harrison, a practical woman in her 40s who'd set up practice in Riverside after Hale's arrest had made the town slightly less hostile to outsiders. "Doctor." Harrison examined May Lynn with gentle efficiency, asking questions, checking her pulse, pressing on her abdomen. Finally, she sat back with an expression that was hard to read. "Well?" May Lynn demanded. "What's wrong with me?" "Nothing's wrong with you," Dr. Harrison said. "You're pregnant." The room went silent. May Lynn stared at her. "That's impossible. I'm 55 years old." "Unlikely, certainly, but not impossible." Dr. Harrison pulled out a notepad. "Based on what you've described, I'd estimate you're about 8 weeks along. It happens sometimes, women in their 50s conceiving when they thought they were past childbearing years. The body is unpredictable." May Lynn looked at Cole, who was standing frozen in the doorway, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked like wonder. "I'm going to have a baby," she said, testing the words. "We're going to have a baby," Cole corrected, and his voice broke on the last word. "Doctor," Harrison smiled. "Congratulations. I'll want to see you regularly to monitor your health. Pregnancies at your age carry some additional risks, but you're strong and healthy, and I see no reason to expect complications." She stood. "I'll let you two process this. Come see me next week, and we'll discuss what to expect." After she left, May Lynn and Cole sat in stunned silence. "A baby," Cole said finally. "After everything, after all these years. I never thought—" May Lynn's voice caught. "I thought that part of my life was over. I had a son once, and I lost him. I thought I'd never—" Cole pulled her into his arms. "You're not alone this time. Whatever happens, we're in this together." May Lynn let herself cry then, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming impossibility of it all. She'd spent decades believing she was too old, too different, too damaged to deserve good things. And here was life, quite literally, proving her wrong. The news spread through town with the same speed everything else did. Some people were scandalized. Others were judgmental, but many, more than Mei Lin expected, were genuinely happy for them. Sarah Chen brought over baby clothes her own grandchildren had outgrown. Tom Wilson built a cradle in his workshop and delivered it without comment. Even some of the people who'd been hostile before softened, because apparently a baby could do what reason and justice couldn't, make them see Mei Lin as human. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. But she accepted their gifts and their awkward congratulations because holding grudges took energy she needed for other things now. The pregnancy was harder than her first one had been 3 decades ago. She tired more easily, her body protesting the demands being made of it. But Dr. Harrison was attentive and Cole was protective to the point of being annoying, and somehow Mei Lin made it through each day and then the next. By the time Hale's trial concluded in May, guilty on all counts, sentenced to hang for Rebecca Stone's murder, Mei Lin was 5 months along and starting to show. She didn't attend the trial. She'd given her deposition months earlier, and she had no desire to sit in a courtroom watching Hale try to justify what he'd done. Catherine Stone went, and Emma made the trip back from St. Louis to be there. They said Hale showed no remorse right up until the moment the verdict was read. Then, finally, he looked afraid. Justice wasn't perfect. It didn't bring Rebecca back or Mary or all the other people Hale had heard over the years. It didn't undo the decades of corruption and cruelty. But it was something. And sometimes something was enough. Summer arrived with heat and the promise of harvest. The ranch was thriving now. Cattle healthy, crops growing, the new barn standing solid and strong. Cole hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Good men who treated Mei Lin with respect and didn't ask invasive questions about her pregnancy. Theodore Grant had moved with his wife to a small house in town, but he visited often, bringing his expertise and his quiet friendship. Emma wrote letters from St. Louis, full of news about her job at a textile factory and the life she was building far from Hale's shadow. And Mei Lin grew rounder and slower, her body changing in ways that were both familiar and strange after so many years. On a warm evening in August, the whole town gathered for the annual harvest celebration. It was the first one since Hale's arrest, and the atmosphere was different, lighter somehow, like everyone was breathing easier without his presence looming over everything. Cole and Mei Lin almost didn't go. She was tired, and crowds still made her uncomfortable. But Sarah Chen had insisted, and sometimes it was easier to agree than to argue. They arrived late, when the festivities were already in full swing. Tables were loaded with food, children were running around playing games, and someone had brought out a fiddle and started playing music. People nodded to them as they passed. Some smiled. A few even called out greetings. And then, as the sun was starting to set and the music was reaching a crescendo, Cole did something Mei Lin never expected. He stood up on one of the empty tables and called for quiet. The crowd settled, curious. "Most of you know me," Cole said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "And most of you know my wife, Mei Lin. And I know what some of you think of us, what you've said behind our backs, and sometimes to our faces." Mei Lin's heart started pounding. What was he doing? "But I need to tell you something," Cole continued. "This woman, my wife, she saved my life, not in some dramatic way, not by pulling me from a fire or stopping a bullet. She saved my life by showing me what courage actually looks like." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. When I met Mei Lin, she was standing on an auction block being sold like property. And she stood there with more dignity than most people show in their entire lives. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't break. And when I gave her a choice, when I offered her a way out, she chose to stay, to work, to fight for something better. Cole's voice got stronger. She worked harder than anyone I've ever met. She rebuilt this ranch when I was too broken to do it myself. She stood up to a man who'd been terrorizing this county for years. She gathered evidence. She convinced people to speak up. She refused to be silenced or intimidated. And she did all of it while most of you were either ignoring what was happening or actively making her life harder. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," Cole said. "I'm telling you because you need to understand something. Mei Lin Zhao didn't just belong in Riverside. She made Riverside better. She forced all of us to face truths we'd been avoiding. She proved that courage and intelligence and worth have nothing to do with where you were born or what you look like or how old you are." He looked down at Mei Lin, and his expression softened. She's carrying our child, and that child is going to grow up in a town that knows their mother is a hero, not in spite of who she is, but because of it. Maylin felt tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Cole to stand in front of the entire town and declare her value like it was an undeniable fact. Cole climbed down from the table and took her hand. I love my wife. I'm proud of my wife. And if any of you still have a problem with that, you can take it up with me. But I'm done pretending to care what you think. The silence that followed was profound. Then Sarah Chen started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Tom Wilson joined in. Then Theodore Grant and his wife. Then others, one by one, until most of the gathering was applauding. Not everyone. Some people turned away, uncomfortable or unwilling to change their minds. But enough people joined in that it sounded like acceptance. It sounded like belonging. Maylin looked at Cole, at this stubborn, broken, impossibly brave man who'd chosen her when everyone else had chosen cruelty. Who'd fought beside her when fighting seemed hopeless. Who loved her not despite her differences, but because of the strength those differences had forged. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. For making them see me. Cole squeezed her hand. They should have seen you all along, but better late than never. The baby was born in late October, 3 weeks early and screaming with indignation at being thrust into the cold world. It was a girl. Doctor. Harrison delivered her with calm efficiency while Cole paced outside, unable to watch, but unable to leave. The labor was long and difficult, Maylin's age making everything harder. But when Dr. Harrison finally placed the tiny, squalling infant in her arms, every moment of pain became irrelevant. She was perfect, small and red-faced and furious, but perfect. Cole came in, pale and shaking, and when he saw his daughter for the first time, he broke down completely. He'd lost so much, his first wife, the future he'd planned, years of his life to grief and survival. But here was something new, something unexpected and precious and full of possibility. They named her Sarah May Maddox, Sarah for the wife Cole had lost, May for the heritage Maylin refused to hide. The baby was healthy despite her early arrival, and within days she'd settled into a routine of eating and sleeping and demanding attention with lungs that seemed impossibly large for such a small body. Maylin had forgotten what it was like to be this exhausted, but she'd also forgotten what it was like to hold a child who was truly hers, in a place where she truly belonged, with a future that wasn't defined by survival. Sarah Chen came to visit and held the baby with tears in her eyes. She's beautiful. Both of you did good. Emma sent a package from St. Louis, hand-sewn baby clothes and a letter full of joy and congratulations. Theodore Grant brought a silver rattle that had belonged to his own children, polished until it gleamed. And slowly, carefully, the town adjusted to the reality of Maylin Maddox and her family. Not everyone changed their minds. Some people still crossed the street to avoid her, still whispered when she passed. But those voices got quieter as the months went on, drowned out by the ones willing to admit they'd been wrong. Spring came again, the second since Maylin had stood on that auction block. The ranch was thriving, the barn stood solid, the cattle were healthy and multiplying, the garden Sarah Chen had helped them plant was producing vegetables. And up on the hill, under the oak tree where Cole's first wife was buried, they'd planted flowers that bloomed in remembrance. On a warm afternoon in April, Maylin sat on the porch with baby Sarah sleeping in her arms, watching Cole work in the fields. The sun was gentle, the breeze was cool, and everything was as close to perfect as life ever got. She thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago, desperate, humiliated, standing on that platform believing her life was over. She thought about all the moments between then and now, all the fear and pain and impossible choices. And she thought about what she'd learned. She'd learned that being old didn't mean being useless, that being different didn't mean being wrong, that fighting back was always worth it, even when you couldn't see how it would end. She'd learned that one person's choice, Cole's choice to step forward when everyone else stayed silent, could change everything. And that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was accept that choice, accept that someone saw value in you when you'd stopped seeing it in yourself. She'd learned that justice was slow and imperfect, but still mattered. That communities could change even if they did it grudgingly and only when forced. That healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let it define your future. Most of all, she'd learned that you were never too old, never too different, never too late to claim the life you deserved. Cole walked up to the porch, dirty and tired from his work, and sat down beside her. He looked at their daughter sleeping peacefully, then at Mei Lin, and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing. How impossible this all is." "Good impossible or bad impossible?" "The best impossible." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I was just thinking, when I was standing on that auction block, I thought I knew what my life was. I thought I'd reached the end of mattering, but I was wrong." "You were very wrong," Cole agreed. "I wasn't at the end. I was at the beginning." She looked down at Sarah, at this tiny person who represented everything she'd thought she'd never have again. Everything before that moment was just surviving. This, she gestured at the ranch, at him, at their daughter. "This is living." Cole kissed the top of her head. "I'm glad you stayed. So am I." They sat together as the sun moved across the sky, as the ranch settled into evening, as their daughter slept and dreamed whatever dreams babies dreamed. And Mei Lin felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Not just contentment, but genuine happiness. She'd survived an ocean crossing and 30 years of invisibility and an auction block and a powerful man's attempts to break her. She'd survived because she was strong enough to endure anything. But she'd thrived because she was brave enough to fight for more than just survival. And sitting there on her porch, in her home, with her family, she finally understood the difference. Survival was waking up each day and getting through it. Living was waking up each day and building something worth keeping. She was 56 years old. She was Chinese in a town that had tried to reject her. She was married to a white man and raising a mixed-race child in a place where that still made some people uncomfortable. And she didn't care. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. Other people's limitations didn't have to become her own. The world had told her she was too old, too different, too late. And she'd proved them wrong simply by refusing to believe them. That was her legacy. Not just to her daughter, but to everyone who'd watched her fight and win. You could start over at any age. You could claim dignity when others tried to strip it away. You could build something beautiful out of ashes and stubborn determination. You could matter, even when the world insisted you didn't. As the stars began to emerge overhead and Cole took Sarah inside to put her to bed, Mei Lin stayed on the porch a moment longer. She looked out at the land she'd helped save, at the life she'd helped build, at the future stretching out before her full of possibility. And she smiled. Because she'd been waiting her whole life for a moment strong enough to prove them all wrong. And she'd finally found it.